Bueno, muy buenos días y bienvenidos al aula García Lorca de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la Universidad de Granada. Hoy tenemos una actividad a la que haya podido organizarse porque hemos recogido varias voluntades y fondos de diversas iniciativas. En primer lugar, esta actividad se ha organizado gracias al programa de ayudas culturales de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la Universidad de Granada y también al apoyo del máster en Filosofía Contemporánea de nuestra universidad. Aunque, por lo tanto, muchísimas gracias a las personas que gestionan la ayuda y que nos han permitido desarrollar lo que hoy vamos a contemplar. Y es una actividad propuesta y organizada por la Cátedra Extraordinaria Filosofía Social de la Discriminación Corporal. La Cátedra Filosofía Social de la Discriminación Corporal es una iniciativa de investigación en la que participan el Instituto de las Mujeres del Gobierno de España, del Ministerio de Igualdad del Gobierno de España y la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la Universidad de Granada, específicamente un grupo de investigadores vinculados desde hace tiempo a la investigación de las relaciones entre cuerpo y trabajo. La historia de esta cátedra comienza hace ya varios años con un debate que tuve después de la publicación de este libro, La cara oscura del capital erótico, capitalización del cuerpo y trastornos alimentarios. Un conjunto de sindicalistas me pidieron si podían debatir conmigo sobre el libro que previamente habían leído y me propusieron que hiciera un trabajo de reescritura de lo fundamental del libro que pudiera ser utilizado en sus debates sindicales, laborales, etcétera. Fue ese trabajo el que dio lugar a un pequeño informe escrito en lenguaje sencillo sobre discriminación corporal en el trabajo, informe que llamó la atención del Instituto de las Mujeres y del Ministerio de Igualdad y que nos propusieron completar con un corpus más amplio de entrevistas y de análisis de situaciones laborales y con una reflexión sobre la discriminación corporal en el trabajo, sobre hombres y mujeres en la España de hoy. Por lo tanto, es de nuevo en nuestra segunda conferencia vinculada a la cátedra y hay un extenso programa de investigación empírica y de transferencia de resultados con organizaciones sindicales, empresariales, políticas, ciudadanas. Y bueno, de nuevo, gracias a las personas que han hecho posible la gestión y la organización de este ilusionante, yo creo que innovador, dispositivo de aplicación de la filosofía social a la realidad laboral de hombres y mujeres en la España de hoy. Bien. Hoy tenemos el placer de recibir a Panagiotis Sotiris. Panagiotis Sotiris es actualmente profesor en la Hellenic Open University y miembro del Consejo editorial de la revista Historical Materialism. Panagiotis Sotiris ha escrito muchísimo sobre cuestiones políticas y filosóficas y entre sus diversos trabajos yo quisiera destacar un libro que consideramos como muy importante, cuyo título es A Philosophy for Communism, Rethinking Althusser. Es precisamente sobre esa cuestión, sobre el pensamiento de Althusser, que hemos pedido a Panagiotis que nos hable hoy, específicamente de la vinculación entre el pensamiento de Althusser y el cuerpo. Panagiotis va a hablar en inglés. La mayoría de ustedes tienen ya el texto en inglés a su disposición. Él va a hacer una intervención y yo voy a hacer pequeños resúmenes. No voy a hacer una traducción sucesiva, absolutamente literal, porque enlentecería mucho la conferencia. ¿De acuerdo? Yo haré pequeños resúmenes y una vez que la conferencia termine, empieza lo más importante, que es el debate. ¿De acuerdo? Panagiotis.
Muchas gracias por esta invitación. Es un honor estar aquí en la misma facultad con Juan Carlos Rodríguez en particular. Pero voy a hablar en inglés. Perdón por esto. Okay, so it was a difficult question because Louis Althusser has not written a lot about the body. But there are a couple of paragraphs in his autobiography where he presents himself as trying to think with his own body, especially when engaging into athletic activities. That he liked to play football and things like to exercise, but it was a way to think with the body. And he connects this love of physical activity with two references. One is to Spinoza and Spinoza's theory of the body and how and the relationship between body and mind in Spinoza, which, as we all know, is a very complex relationship. One might say that the mind is kind of a potentia of the body, and also and in the written text I have a couple of propositions from second part of Ethics, which exactly points to the importance that Spinoza attributed to the body. But above all, Althusser links this idea of thinking with your body to what he would later describe as theoretical practice. And this will be the my main presentation. What does Althusser means by theoretical practice, and in which way it points to the question of how we think, how bodies think. Let's put it this way. I say from the beginning that this is not about those endless debates about how thinking is a function of the body. This is okay. Let's take this for granted. There's no immaterial spirit, there's no immaterial soul, and what we call thinking also takes place inside our brains as electrochemical reaction. Okay, let's take this for granted, because if you go in that road, you end up again with the same dualism. The question is, and I will use it, I use a phrase from an American philosopher, Arthur Danto. It's the title of a collection of essays, is how to treat, let's say, theory as a body-body problem. Danto refers this, it's very interesting. I recommend to read Arthur Danto, one of the most important philosophers of aesthetics of our time, but also refers it to Descartes. It's very interesting. He says that even in Descartes, it's about a relationship, the body-mind relationship is a body-body relationship. But I would more point, when I refer to bodies, I always find very fascinating the way Michel Foucault used the notion of the body in his writings, especially on the 1970s.
Muy bien. Althusser no escribió específicamente sobre el cuerpo, pero hay dos párrafos en su autobiografía, que en castellano lleva el título del Porvenir, el largo, donde señala la importancia de cómo pensar por el propio cuerpo, con el propio cuerpo. Algo que está vinculado, digamos, a aspectos fundamentales de su propia vida personal. En primer lugar, Althusser era un deportista, hacía diversas actividades atléticas, fundamentalmente fútbol, de lo que era un fan absoluto, y también el problema de cómo salir de un tipo de reflexividad intelectual que era incapaz de actuar específicamente sobre el mundo y transformarlo. Son esos dos párrafos de la autobiografía de Althusser los que dan sentido a la cuestión que va a plantearse Panagiotis Sotiris hoy: cómo se piensa con el propio cuerpo. Bien, en la teoría de Althusser eso está vinculado a la relación, al paralelismo mente-cuerpo en la filosofía de Spinoza. de la cual Althusser hizo una recuperación marxista extraordinariamente interesante, y gracias a esa relación con la teoría de Spinoza y a su propia inquietud autobiográfica, Panagiotis Sotiris, pese a la falta de referencias textuales específicas en los libros de Althusser, va a intentar reflexionar sobre la idea de práctica teórica en Althusser y qué es lo que la idea de práctica teórica en Althusser puede enseñarnos acerca del cuerpo. Bien, hay una serie de cuestiones que funcionan como preámbulo. Por ejemplo, no nos vamos a ocupar en este debate, aunque sin duda sería de interés, sobre el problema característico de la relación mente-cuerpo, la existencia o no orgánica de la mente, y aunque Panagiotis Sotiris lo vincularía lo que va a contar con las propuestas del filósofo norteamericano Arthur Danto. Arthur Danto nos propuso pensar el problema cuerpo-mente como el problema cuerpo-cuerpo, porque en realidad son dos formas del cuerpo, como un poco nos enseña Spinoza, las que se singularizan como pensamiento y como extensión en el espacio. Otra referencia fundamental al respecto es la obra por todos conocida y muy popular de Michel Foucault sobre el cuerpo, específicamente su libro Vigilar y Castigar.
Okay, yes. So I will not go into that part, although I always love reading those passages from Foucault, where he says, what is a subject? It's a subjected body, how the body is produced. So, but I will take this also for granted for reasons of time. So I would indeed go to the notion of theoretical practice. Now, this is something that Althusser introduces in 1963 in a famous article on the sur la dialectique matérialiste, on the materialist dialectic. Interestingly enough, this article is a response to the criticism he had received from his previous article on contradiction and overdetermination. So it's important to remember that he introduces the notion of theoretical practice within a debate on how we think the structure of social totality in materialist terms, which is this idea that we need a notion of totality that does not have a center, a notion of totality that includes that very important notion of the overdetermination. And it is within this context that he introduces, let's say, his own epistemology. And the crucial notion is the notion of practice. Now, practice in Althusser is, to use Aristotelian terms, is both, let's say, praxis and poiesis. In particular, in this text, practice is a process. It's a production process. It's a process of transformation. And it's very interesting that he gives that also as a definition. It says that by practice in general, I shall mean any process of transformation of determinate given raw material into a determinate product, a transformation effected by determinate human labor, using determinate means of production, etc., etc. And the crucial, and he insists that what is the crucial moment is the labor of transformation. So when we refer to practice, it's not simply that we do something, it's that we work on something, we transform something. This is a more general, Althusser will return also in the 1970s to this notion of practice, but I have to, it's important to bear that in mind. So let me be clear, this is not about pragmatism. It's not about the truth of a sentence is its practical proof or use. It's something else. It's that Theory and knowledge is a process of transformation.
Bien, no va a proporcionar las citas de Foucault que se tienen y da por hecho que todo el mundo conoce la obra de Foucault, por lo menos sus referencias fundamentales. Se va a centrar en la conferencia, como ya lo ha dicho, específicamente en la categoría althusseriana de práctica, que es una categoría que se produce a partir de dos textos publicados en los años 60 sobre la dialéctica materialista y contradicción y sobredeterminación. Ambos textos estarían recogidos en la primera obra conocida de Althusser, en castellano titulada La revolución teórica de Marx. Bien, el propósito de ambos textos era cómo podemos pensar la totalidad estructural, la estructura social, en un sentido materialista. Y para eso, Aristóteles evoca una categoría, una vieja categoría, una venerable categoría de la tradición filosófica, que es la categoría de práctica, una categoría que tiene su origen en Aristóteles y que refiere a dos tipos de procesos de transformación: la praxis, un proceso de transformación donde el propio sujeto que efectúa la actividad se transforma también a sí mismo, y la poiesis, que es el proceso de producción de una realidad. La categoría de práctica en Althusser, y es específicamente lo importante, sirve para pensar la creación teórica. Esa creación teórica se caracteriza, la creación teórica y otro tipo de prácticas de tipo político, intelectual, etcétera, por lo siguiente: la existencia de un proceso en el cual, ante un material dado y empleando unos ciertos medios de producción, y hay que ver ahora específicamente qué medios de producción, se genera un producto específico. Lo que interesa fundamentalmente a Althusser en esta definición de la práctica teórica como producción es específicamente cómo se realiza el trabajo de transformación. Es desde ese eje, desde ese marco, desde el que va a hablar el profesor Sotiris. No es, o sea, la cuestión aquí de la práctica no tiene nada que ver con el pragmatismo y con todos los problemas que plantea, cómo establecemos el valor de verdad de una proposición.
Now, and what kind of practice are we, what kind of material process it is, theory? It is, for Althusser, a material process of rupture with ideology, which through a series of transformation produces knowledge. So there is a product in the end, as in a production process. This is knowledge. Now, this also means that, contrary to what is our immediate reaction or perception, for Althusser, knowledge comes knowledge of the concrete, the concrete reality as it is being known by us, comes at the end of a project. And I will insist why this is a very important distinction that Althusser. It comes. We do not start by knowing, even if we are perceiving. We do not know. We perceive, but we do not know. Let's put it in a simple way. This requires a series of transformations and ruptures, ruptures with what seems evident to us. This is where the specific means of production, concepts and theories enter. And I will explain that later. Why do we need the first, this process of transformation? Because the starting, the raw material is, in a sense, ideological. And it's interesting, Althusser has one reference on that. There are two references. I will discuss the second afterwards, which is, one might say, Spinoza's three kinds of knowledge. But the first reference is a passage from Marx. And this is a text which we usually call it the introduction to the Grundrisse, although it's not certain whether it was an introduction to the Grundrisse or the 1857 introduction, which we call it that way to distinguish it from the 1859 introduction, which That is a joke, not necessary to translate. In French, there's always a confusion which introduction one is referring, and translators of Althusser have a problem. Anyway, if you go back to that text of Marx, which is fantastic, it says that, it says, okay, it would seem real to start with the real and concrete. For example, with the population, what is more real and concrete than a population? But then Marx says, but population is an abstraction. Where are the classes? Where is wage? Where is labor? Where is capital? And continues Marx. This presupposes exchange, division of labor, prices. Capital is nothing without wage labor. So, in this manner, Marx shows that if you start with what seems like evidently concrete, you know nothing. You have to use notions, that is abstractions, to realize what is the concrete that you see in the first place. So in a certain way, Marx, and this is a very provocative phrase, he says, would you go from the abstract to the concrete? You go from abstract notions, capital, wage, labor, and then you arrive at the concrete Spanish society today.
Bien, muchas gracias. El proceso de conocimiento, dice Althusser, es un proceso de ruptura. Es un proceso de ruptura y hay algo muy importante que Althusser introduce. Ese proceso de ruptura con preconcepciones ideológicas, vamos a ver ahora un ejemplo de eso, nunca empieza en la realidad de los sentidos. De hecho, a la realidad se llega al final. La realidad no está al comienzo, sino que la realidad llega al final. Esto parece paradójico, pero se va a entender bien. Además de la referencia a Spinoza, Althusser se refiere a un texto de Marx, de la introducción a los Grundrisse, seguramente escrito en 1857, donde Marx dice, bueno, ¿cómo comenzamos a conocer la realidad? Por ejemplo, podemos empezar por la población española. Vamos a conocer España, bueno, Marx no dice eso, es un ejemplo que ha puesto Panagiotis y que voy a seguir en la traducción. Vamos a conocer España, empezamos por la población española. Pero dice Marx enseguida, bueno, pero la población es una abstracción. Eso es completamente abstracto. Nosotros necesitamos saber cómo se ganan la vida, a qué grupos sociales pertenecen, cuáles son sus condiciones económicas, sus condiciones de estatus. Es decir, el primer objeto que se nos presenta la población española es obviamente una abstracción ideológica. Aunque nos parece que estamos tocando la realidad cuando decimos vamos a hablar de España o vamos a hablar de los españoles. Exactamente que es una abstracción, añado, cuando decimos este es nuestro cuerpo. ¿Qué quiere decir en nuestro cuerpo? Es un proceso fisiológico, social, cultural, prefigurado por la herencia, prefigurado por la ideología, por la forma de división sexual del trabajo. La fórmula provocadora de Marx, señala el profesor Sotiris, es que el conocimiento va de lo abstracto a lo concreto. Porque solo al final, cuando hemos roto la categoría abstracta de población, o cuando hemos roto la categoría abstracta de cuerpo, empezamos a ver una realidad específica que, como dice Marx, es la síntesis de múltiples determinaciones. Por tanto, el conocimiento, lejos de empezar por lo concreto, transforma las abstracciones de partida y nos propone un producto que es la realidad concreta.
Mm-hmm. Right. And indeed, as Professor Pestaña insisted, this is a phrase by Marx. The concrete is concrete because it is a synthesis of many determinations. So this is Althusser's reference. Now, another important point before explaining how this notion of the process is also.
Sorry, could you get closer?
Oh yes, sure. Yes. Now this notion of the process is very different than the traditional image of knowing. The traditional image of knowing is a subject and an object. It's obvious that here we're dealing with something different, a process, which is also, we can suppose, it is also non-individual, non-subjective, it is social, it is collective, and this is also evident. So in this sense, it's not about reality just being over there to be extracted, to be or reflected. There's no such thing in actual knowledge process. This is because of the intervention of ideology. We will discuss this a little bit later. So there's need to be some kind of transformation. And Althusser insists, this is a position, one might say, very anti-empiricist, against empiricism, that we never start from, concrete sense, data or something like that. And he uses, in a provocative way, he describes knowledge as in the schema of three generalities. He insists on generalities, it's important, it's abstraction. So generality one is perceptions, what we see, what we perceive, what we see. They are never, one might say, neutral. They include previous knowledges, previous abstractions, ideological elements, anything like that. To arrive at generalities three, as he calls them, that is concrete knowledge, you need generalities two, which are concepts. Now, give an example, simple example, in what sense it is, and this is an example that Althusser himself uses in a later book and text in Reading Capital. Of course, for example, you can see that in the reading of Capitalism, one example, which is the crucial, one might say, conceptual innovation by Marx, the notion of labor power, instead of simply labor in the exchange, in the wage, because it points to a way to understand exploitation. This is exactly a kind of generality too that helps under the perceived is transformed into, you see exploitation where you saw equal exchange. You see the same things. It's not about, it's and this is also a phrase from Althusser, the visible and the invisible, what you see and you don't see, are part of what you see. But this is this is a transformative aspect of, let's say, any scientific revolution. And Althusser uses another example, and the example is simply, he refers to Lavoisier. Lavoisier, the same phenomena, what's happening in burning. Until then, not traditional, it was rather scientific chemistry thought that there's some kind of special substance there, phlogiston or des choses comme ça. But no. Lavoisier used another conceptual framework, which was what? Violent oxidization by means of a violent union with oxygen, which is burning. So it solved the problem that where is that substance, where is the weight of that substance that supposedly entered, and then we could not find it. But he also saw something different. So this was the same phenomenon. A flame is burning. This is what Althusser describes as generalities too. Those concepts which usually emerge in scientific revolutions, but help us produce knowledge. It's a product. Our knowledge of burning is not that we saw something burning. It's a product of a conceptual transformation. Our knowledge of exploitation is the same. Our knowledge of gravity is a product of the conceptual transformation by Newton. Our knowledge of subatomic dynamics is a product of other scientific revolutions after Max Planck, etc., etc., etc. Or our knowledge of what's happening with our psyche is the result of a crucial concept, which is the unconscious in Freud.
Bien, una idea importante es pensar el conocimiento no como la relación que tendemos a pensar inmediatamente entre un sujeto y un objeto, sino como un proceso. No es una relación individual donde está el sujeto, los datos se reflejan en el sujeto y el sujeto conoce. Esa es la concepción empirista del conocimiento que Althusser llama extractiva. Es como si el empirismo pensase que en la realidad hay una esencia, la población española, extraigo la esencia al mirarla y, chimpum, ya tengo el conocimiento. No funciona así. No es un proceso individual, no es la relación entre un sujeto y un objeto, es un proceso de transformación. Un proceso de transformación que Althusser describe bajo la idea de tres generalidades, pero que podéis pensar también desde el punto de vista de los tres géneros del conocimiento de Spinoza. Las tres generalidades de Althusser son los tres géneros del conocimiento de Spinoza. Primer género del conocimiento. Nosotros encontramos personas, españoles, hombres, mujeres. Eso parece evidente. En realidad, a poco que nos preguntemos, para comprender específicamente cómo son esas personas, esos españoles, esos hombres o esas mujeres, tenemos que conocer mucho sobre su situación social, simbólica, cultural. La primera visión del mundo que nos aparece, aquí José Luis Moreno Pestaña, profesor español, primera visión del mundo, es la generalidad 1. Sobre esa generalidad 1, ¿qué hago? Trabajo con conceptos que transforman la visión que yo tenía de esa realidad que se me presenta ante mí. Segundo género de conocimiento de Spinoza, generalidad 2. Tengo un cuerpo, de José Luis Moreno Pestaña no es lo mismo de decir tengo un cuerpo de un español de clase media con una trayectoria específica que usa determinadas prácticas estéticas vinculadas a la división sexual del trabajo. La realidad 1, este tipo que está delante mía, por medio de la utilización de conceptos, segundo género de conocimiento, generalidad 2, se va transformando en un proceso inacabado y permanente de conocimiento de lo concreto. Generalidad 3, tercer género de conocimiento de Spinoza. Es esta visión la que permite a Althusser explicar la ruptura epistemológica de Marx. Todo el mundo ve que hay trabajo y capital, pero cuando se interroga el trabajo se da uno cuenta que lo que se vende es fuerza de trabajo, capaz de producir más valor que el que recibe para su propia autorreproducción. Todo el mundo ve lo mismo, pero no se ve lo mismo según el marco teórico de análisis que se tiene. Son los conceptos de la generalidad 2 los que nos permiten un proceso de conocimiento colectivo y global que nos permite ir acercándonos de manera tendencialmente infinita, nunca terminada, al conocimiento de la realidad concreta, en términos spinozianos, el conocimiento de Dios.
So, yes, yes, indeed, it is. There is a relation here with Spinoza. It's not the same, because as we know, the first kind of knowledge in Spinoza is very similar to generalities 1. It's a theory of ideology, and then we have common notions, the second kind of knowledge, it's a very interesting, the theory of common notions, because it's a very kind of social theory of knowledge, but which produces also the second type of knowledge in Spinoza, also the kind of knowledge that Althusser called generalities 3, because the third kind of knowledge, as is a more intellectualis day, which is, it's kind of a more emancipatory. But of course we can say that if you understand social reality, this also has an emancipatory effect, in the sense that freedom is not the absence of determination, freedom is the knowledge and understanding of determination and constraint. So it's very, now there's a few points more about Althusser and this conception of theoretical practice. One, Althusser never says that concrete knowledge of reality equals reality. There's always a kind, it's an asymptomatic, you never arrive, because there's an ontological difference between reality and knowledge of reality. Of course, there's an approximation. This is the first point. The second point is that Althusser refuses to point to a mechanism of guarantees. This is very, 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 very interesting. There's no guarantees that one kind of conceptual transformation, one kind of new concepts will actually offer a knowledge of concrete reality that is, let's say, more approximate. There are no guarantees. So this is a break with traditional theories of knowledge. Traditional theories of knowledge are theories of guarantees of knowledge. Cartesian cogito, it's a guarantee. If it's conceptually solid, it's good, it's rational. Empiricism. And we all know the problems that theories of guarantees have. The entire history, for example, of analytical philosophy is exactly this, this difficulty. There's neither verification or falsification of a theory if you drive this to the extremes, okay? And if you are interested in analytical philosophy, after Quine in the 1950s, you see that these questions are abandoned. But this is another story. So there's no guarantees, and there is an open question about what does Althusser mean by a theory of theoretical practice, which seemed, and this was his self-criticism afterwards, that it seemed like a classical philosophy of the science in the sense of a science of the science, but he abandons this notion. But still, even when he introduces the notion of theory of theoretical practice, he never refers to guarantees. A classical question of verification. He says no, it's an attempt to theorize the process of knowledge, how the knowledge effect, this is his phrase, is produced. I also think that this points to a much more, let's say, social and material conception of knowledge. Again, the emphasis is on process, on transformation, on interaction, not simply on an object seeing reality. And one point before you. And it is also interesting that Althusser has a very idiosyncratic, one might say, definition of empiricism. Because empiricism in Althusser's description includes both what we would call classical empiricism, but also what we would call non-empiricist realism. For example, causative realism, such as Hilary Putnam. No, he doesn't refer to Putnam, but I'm using it as an example. So for Althusser, it's very simple. Any theory that says that there is reality, and somehow reality, we grasp its truth, and we have this ability, somehow we have a clear vision, and we see, and we grasp, and we reproduce it as knowledge. This is an empiricist, and in the last instance, idealist conception of knowledge. One might say, we use a metaphor, this is mine, that knowledge is a result, is an effect. It is sometimes an unexpected result, or an unexpected outcome. It's the outcome of a process. It's not something that it is out there. Out there is reality. On that we can agree. There is something out there. Okay, but whether we know it or not, this is a question of conceptual and theoretical transformations. And when I say conceptual and theoretical transformation, this also includes experimentation. In an experiment, and we know that also from other epistemological tradition, is not an empirical test. An experiment is a practical, theoretical construction. Okay, so this is the notion of the process. Knowledge comes at the end as a result. Not sure. That's always open questions. But it comes at the end of a process. Of a process of rupture with ideology, which will help me get into also this notion.
Bien, después de hacer una precisión sobre el paralelismo que yo he hecho entre las tres generalidades y los tres géneros del conocimiento de Spinoza, e indicar que en el segundo género del conocimiento, en el uso de nociones comunes, la correspondencia no es evidentemente clara con Althusser, el profesor Sotiris se ha centrado en una cuestión básica que diferencia la epistemología de Althusser y la noción de práctica teórica de las epistemologías que estamos acostumbrados a estudiar, por ejemplo, en filosofía de la ciencia. En filosofía de la ciencia, o buena parte de la filosofía de la ciencia, el problema fundamental es el de la garantía del conocimiento. ¿Cuáles son las bases por las que podemos decir que un enunciado es verdadero o no es verdadero? Es un proceso de verificación, es un proceso de en la búsqueda de un proceso activo de falsación. Hay diversas posibilidades, diversos dispositivos epistemológicos con los que intentamos pensar cuáles son las garantías del conocimiento. Sotiris insiste, eso es absolutamente legítimo, pero no es lo que caracteriza la epistemología de Althusser. La epistemología de Althusser está basada en dos cuestiones fundamentales. La primera, a la que ya hemos hecho referencia, una noción del empirismo y del realismo muy provocadora. Empirista es todo aquel que pretende que se extrae el conocimiento de la realidad. Es un tipo de empirismo que en las clasificaciones normales de historia de la filosofía recogería diversas formas de concepción del conocimiento, que en el fondo es un tipo de idealismo, porque lo que se extrae de la realidad nunca es la realidad en sí, sino una idea específica de esa realidad, que supuestamente aparece ante nuestros ojos, somos capaces de recuperarla de la realidad. Entonces, primera idea importante, la definición idiosincrásica de empirismo. Y en segundo lugar, la idea de que el conocimiento es siempre un resultado, un producto. Cuando nosotros experimentamos, no estamos dialogando cara a cara con la realidad. Lo que hacemos es establecer, por medio de instrumentos técnicos y un determinado plan de experimentación, una transformación específica de lo que conocemos gracias a un dispositivo de experimentación que va a generar un producto distinto. Esa idea de proceso colectivo en el cual el conocimiento es un producto final es el segundo elemento fundamental de la epistemología de Althusser.
Okay. Now, Althusser will try and, let's say, a little bit elaborate more on these questions later. One other point. It's also important that when we're talking about knowledge, Althusser refuses the distinction between essence and phenomena. That is, knowledge is not, because the distinction between essence and phenomena is also, can be, in Althusserian terms, a variety of empiricism. Why do we have false image of reality, and then through knowledge we have true knowledge? Because initially we perceive phenomena, and then we look for essences or substances, what is really happening. Now, of course, the essence-phenomena distinction can be very useful as a metaphor, but ontologically, Althusser, on that, he is also a Spinozist, and he's very similar, one might say, to Deleuze. There's no dualism. Everything is on the same ontological plane. Reality, there's no hidden reality. Okay, so reality is both phenomena and essence at the same time. And this is also because of ideology. So there's no, let's make clear. So it's not about, I try to find the essential. No, I try to produce knowledge by trying to see what are the many determinations of reality, in particular social reality, using hope, trying to produce collectively, and through the obstacles I find in my research and the many determinations that also theoretical practice has, that enable me to break and understand. So this is an important distinction. Now, Althusser will later insist that theoretical practice is not a, let's say, an isolated practice. It's not isolated from the rest of society. It is practice, production by itself, but it's also part of broader process. So he would insist a lot on the many ways that social determination, social practices, political practices, ideological practices influence theoretical practice. And it's interesting that this is the reason he changes his definition of philosophy. And in particular also a potential Marxist or materialist philosophy. As I told you, initially he had this idea of what is philosophy. It is a theory of theoretical practice, but this can be very, very idealist. So he thinks that, first of all, philosophy is not about, let's say, knowledge. Philosophy does not produce concepts that produce knowledges. What does it produce? It produces theses, it produces positions. It produces interventions that change the relation of forces. Why? And this is, of course, something we can discuss. For Althusser, the interconnection of theoretical practice with ideological practice, with political practice, with class struggle, this interconnection takes a particularly philosophical form. And that's why he uses the notion, and he uses the notion of a spontaneous philosophy of the scientist. So what is philosophy? Philosophy is the terrain of these conflicts, the terrain of this, the obstacles, the epistemological obstacles, plus whatever is happening in society. So this is when we philosophize, either spontaneously, for example, when we try to establish methodological criteria for our work, or when we are philosophizing as philosophers in a more abstract manner. And that's why he has this provocative final definition of philosophy as, in the final instance, in the last instance, sorry, class struggle in theory. But let's at this stage keep from this definition exactly that this is a very contradictory process, theoretical practice. It is itself determined and overdetermined by whatever is happening in society. So it's a process, it's overdetermined, it's complex. But Althusser never abandons this idea that it is about production of knowledge through a process of transformation and the process of ruptures with the ideological. This is something that he never abounds, but he thinks in a more complex and less schematic way whatever is involved in this process. This is the redefinition of philosophy.
Bien, lo primero que nos ha propuesto es hacer una salvedad respecto a la relación entre conocimiento y cuerpo, y nos ha recordado las tesis de Deleuze sobre Spinoza. Digamos, estamos en el mismo plano. No hay un plano que es el de la experiencia mental y otro el de la experiencia corporal. Son el mismo plano. Esto es importantísimo porque si no entraríamos en una realidad con escalas diferentes y con una ontología dualista. Es el mismo proceso, se da en el mismo plano. Se trata de comprender las múltiples determinaciones que aparecen en ese plano, a veces como idea, a veces como movimiento de cuerpo. Bien, una cuestión básica es la definición de filosofía, y aquí hay un cambio en Althusser que es muy importante. En primer lugar, la filosofía es definida como la teoría de la práctica teórica, debido a que todo proceso de transformación de la realidad supone una práctica intelectual de transformación de las preconcepciones y de la ideología que tenemos, las prácticas teóricas. La filosofía se convertiría en la teoría de las múltiples prácticas teóricas, científicas, culturales, políticas, que constituyen nuestra realidad. Primera definición. Posteriormente, Althusser abandona esa definición que le parece extremadamente idealista y señala que la filosofía produce algo que no es conocimiento. El conocimiento lo produce el trabajo científico. ¿Qué es lo que produce la filosofía? Tesis, posiciones que actúan en la realidad. Lo que produce una filosofía son tesis sobre la realidad, sobre prácticas teóricas que se desarrollan en la realidad, que permiten intervenir en formas de definición de las prácticas teóricas. Por ejemplo, tenemos la práctica teórica de los científicos. En esa práctica teórica, aparte de saber utilizar un instrumental científico, hay herramientas lógicas, concepciones del conocimiento, etcétera. Hay lo que llama Althusser una filosofía espontánea de los científicos, como hay una filosofía espontánea de los profesores de universidad o una filosofía espontánea de los estudiantes de filosofía de cuarto de carrera. Hay una filosofía espontánea. En esa filosofía espontánea, la filosofía introduce las diferentes concepciones de la filosofía, introducen tesis que actúan teóricamente en la concepción de la realidad. Althusser señala que la filosofía es lucha de clases en la teoría, específicamente en la teoría. Es un conflicto que sucede en la teoría, pero que tiene efectos en las prácticas teóricas. Esta idea es muy importante, se irá complejizando, pero con distintas singularizaciones permanecerá en la obra de Althusser. Después de la ruptura con la primera visión que el profesor Sotiris ha señalado, es extremadamente idealista, porque es la filosofía como reina de la ciencia, la teoría de las prácticas teóricas.
And to give an example of how theory is traversed by multiple determinations, let's take, if you look, for example, in the 20th century, on the debates around, let's say, quantum theory, how we incorporate the Copenhagen school version of quantum theory. You can see that, and you can see that in the very personalities of those people. This kind of struggle. On the one hand, it is what they find, yes, indeterminacy, which is not chance, it's something more complex, but you find it. This is what the conceptual transformation point to. How then are you going to incorporate? And you have and then you can see how ideology enters in the various interpretations of it. Or you can see that, again, to take an example for physics, Big Bang theory, not the series, which is very good, the actual theory. Okay, yes. Big Bang, that there is a kind of a very specific singularity, is something that is the result of very specific conceptual transformation. It's if you work on the based on general relativity, etc., and it's also somehow been corroborated by many experiments. But then comes ideology. Is this a God moment or not? So the idea of these are the kind of the philosophical debates that emerge. So what is the idea of philosophy as transformation? The idea of philosophy as transformation, as intervention, is exactly how do you intervene? This is a relation of forces. Scientists are both idealist and materialist. If we say that materialism is what is closer to reality. This is the idea of philosophy as intervention. You see a debate, you see how can you intervene? how can you, let's say, produce positions, not a theory of theories, but some positions. Okay, let's accept the materiality of physics and let's not introduce God. This is a philosophical position. It's not knowledge. But you try to move the relation of forces to the one side or to the other side. And these questions you can find in social sciences, physics, in questions of medicine, and this is why it's still important to philosophize, but to have to understand what philosophy is, understand its limits, but also its potential. Now, but I have now come to the question of ideology, because so far ideology is a kind of a void in Althusser. That is, what is ideology in the text of the 1963, 64, 65? It's the opposite of science. It's Spinoza's first kind of knowledge, which is it's very, very, very good if you look at how Spinoza describes, for example, the first kind of knowledge, singular things which have been represented to us through the senses in a way that it is mutilated, confused, and without order for the intellect. This is a very good description of ideology, but it's not only that, it's also previous perception. So Althusser attempts to rethink the question of ideology in the end of the 1960s. And he writes a very big manuscript, which is called On Reproduction. We now have the full manuscript, at least in French, in English, and some other languages. But for some time, Althusser chose to publish only one part. This is the famous article on ideology and ideological apparatuses of the state. And now, and there are very specific positions here. What is the first one? Ideology represents individual imaginary relation to the real conditions of existence. So it's very interesting. It's a very interesting definition. It's a relation to relationships. Because conditions of existence means social relation. So it's a kind of a second relationality. It's a way you relate to your... This is the first one. And the second one is that ideology has a material existence. Because ideology is not simply something we think. It's mainly something we do. Ideology is not, first of all, that you can wake up in the morning and start, let's say, praising the merits of capitalism, even if you are a worker. Ideology is the fact you to think it is natural for people to wake up every morning and go and do the same job. This is ideology, that you find it natural. This is your imaginary relationship to the reality. It's not necessarily, ideology does not mean that you like. Ideology is not a lie. You don't live in a lie. You don't live it's not hallucination. Okay? Ideology is exactly that kind of lived experience, that extra layer that makes you think that things are as they are, that they are natural, that they are accepted. And it's expressed in practices, how you act, how you behave yourself, etc., etc. And it's also produced by practices. There's a phrase by Pascal, Blaise Pascal, that Althusser uses. It says that you kneel down, you move your lips in prayer, and you will believe. Actually, the phrase in Pascal is a little bit different, but this is so. Yes, because the repetition of practices, of rituals, of what you do, and this is important because this is something very corporeal. This is something we do with your body. And you can give these examples. If you look at Foucault in Surveiller et Punir, it's exactly that. What is the factory? How the bodies are dressed to wake up every morning, to go to work, to be productive, how the army produces. So, and this is also produces ideology. So this is very, very, very important. That, so So, there are also two more important points about ideology, famous points that I just like to repeat. One, ideology has no outside, but it is nothing but outside. These are very nice. So, ideology, there's no, I mean, we are always inside the ideology. We are always inside our collective practices, significations, speech acts, knowledge traditions, and of course, any theory of ideology is based on that we live in a symbolic universe. We live in a universe where we are all immersed into, we become humans when we are immersed into the symbolic space. So there's no outside. But it is nothing but outside. It's not self-produced ideology. Ideology is the product of historical, social determinations, in all its complexity. It's about the fact that the societies where we live in, class relationship, the histories of this class relationship, in all it is, its complexity. So, and the final definition is that what does ideology do? It interpellates us as subjects. That is, how do we become subjects? How do we become able to say, I am, I do, I think? Huh? This natural enunciation. Huh? Because we are inside the field of ideology. And Althusser uses this word, interpellation, which is also a kind of a legal term. When you are interpellated, it can also be part of you being arrested. And there's a big discussion on that. But for this, but let me stick to that subjectivity is also a product. Okay, it's also a result of being part of the ideological field. It's not primary. We are not born subjects, as as Athena was born a fully formed goddess out the head of Zeus. We become subjects after being interpellated by the field of ideology.
Bien, después de una intervención y una reflexión interesantísima sobre los debates en física, etcétera, llegamos al centro del problema de la ideología y de las definiciones específicas que Althusser va dando de la cuestión de la ideología, con lo que nos vamos acercando cada vez más a la cuestión del cuerpo y a la cuestión que nos ocupa en la conferencia. Ya hemos visto con una intervención filosófica algo que intenta mover una situación determinada en un conjunto de prácticas sociales específicas. Bien, ¿y cómo interviene Althusser en la cuestión de la ideología? En primer lugar, hay una primera concepción donde la ideología es lo diferente de la ciencia. Se diferencia la ideología de la ruptura epistemológica que permite un conocimiento correcto de la realidad. Primera versión. La segunda versión es extremadamente compleja y rica, y hay varias aseveraciones de Althusser que hay que tener en cuenta. La primera es que la ideología representa la relación imaginaria que los individuos, que ustedes y yo tenemos con nuestras condiciones de existencia. Es la relación imaginaria que tenemos con lo que hacemos y lo que somos. La ideología es una relación. Nosotros vivimos una realidad y tenemos una relación imaginaria con esa realidad. Primera definición. Segunda definición de la ideología es que la ideología tiene una existencia material. Son un conjunto de prácticas y de rituales. La referencia de Althusser es una fórmula del gran filósofo Blaise Pascal. Si quieres creer, arrodíllate y reza. Primero te arrodillas y reza y luego crees. Primero es la práctica material de los cuerpos. La práctica material de los cuerpos genera ideas, genera experiencias específicas. Esto es fundamental. La ideología no es algo que está en los cerebros, es una práctica que tiene que ver con los rituales en los que estamos inmersos. Magnífica fórmula de Pascal: si quieres creer, arrodíllate y reza, que Althusser recoge para explicar el fundamento material de la ideología. Bien, a partir de aquí Althusser hace, digamos, una distinción tremendamente sutil. La primera es: la ideología no tiene exterior. Es decir, todo el mundo vivimos en un conjunto de prácticas, de experiencias vividas, y no podemos salir de ahí. No nos salimos de la bañera y miramos cómo estamos en la bañera y luego volvemos a entrar. Estamos continuamente inmersos en el agua de nuestras prácticas. Primera idea importante: la ideología no tiene exterior. Y por otra parte, ¿qué es la ideología? Pues nada más que su exterior. No es una cosa distinta al conjunto de prácticas rituales que te permiten creer después de arrodillarte y rezar, o de hacer las 1000 cosas que constituyen la práctica de la ideología. El profesor Sotiris señala la importancia de esto para comprender otra fórmula fundamental de la visión althusseriana de la ideología. La ideología interpela, como en una práctica legal, a los individuos como sujetos. Dice: tú eres un sujeto de una práctica. Tú eres un estudiante, los estudiantes toman notas. Tú eres profesor, los profesores llevan chaqueta. La práctica interpela a los individuos como si fueran sujetos. Dice: tú. Es una práctica donde se le dice al individuo: hay una dimensión de ti que tiene que salir, si no, no eres un sujeto. Interpelación de los individuos como sujetos.
Now, this notion of this introduction and this criticism of the notion of the subject is very, very important for two reasons. One is that at the same period, the 1968-69, Althusser introduces another notion that history is a process without a subject, but process without a subject is a more general notion in Althusser. I might say that for Althusser, this is a definition, one might say, of materiality. That is what it means. We think that something is a material process. It's a process without a subject, and it's true in a certain way. This is for example, what happened to the birth of physics, even or mathematics in antiquity. We stop thinking that the gods are angry and throw thunder to the earth, and we say this is a phenomenon. We might not have a theory, but this is the first. This is a natural process. This is when we think of a social process. Even if we think, for example, in terms of classical sociology of the 19th century, this was a big step ahead. There is a social phenomenon which is not necessarily the outcome of a kind of design, either divine or human. So this is also an important distinction, but it is also important, and to that we can see both Althusser and also a student of Althusser and a very important linguist, Michel Pessoa, one of the pioneers of discourse analysis, including discourse analysis aided by computer. Unfortunately, he killed himself in 1983. He had a lot more to give, but in the 1960s and 70s he was very creative as a linguist, but also, let's say, in questions of epistemology. and the relation between language and ontology. And why I turn to per se, and in the written text I discuss it, because it also points to how scientific process, scientific production, theoretical practice is a process without a subject. It's not that actual persons, actual actual subjected bodies, subjectified bodies are there, though there are. I'm not saying it's a kind of a mechanical process, but even knowledge is not about a subject encountering reality. It's about a collective process where, let's say, subjectified bodies interact. And this is interesting if you see that in the actual scientific process, and you can see that if you do concrete research on scientists, how knowledge as an unexpected outcome sometimes comes despite, for example, the personal ideological presuppositions of individual researchers. And you can see that with many scientists, important scientists that made great discoveries, while personally they were, for example, very idealist or very religious, but at the same time. So it is a kind of, let's say that it is a material, in a material process of science, this is my reading, you have a kind of a double displacement, decentering of the subject. One, in the sense that it is a collective process, that it is the material that dominates the subject and not the subject the material. If you think, and this is also for abstract thinking, for theoretical thinking, for mathematics, you enter into a process of transformation, you work with the material works on you, even if it's just equations. And of course this is more obvious when we talk scientific experimentation, etc. So you confront something, reality, you can say that. It's a struggle. So it's not about just a subject, it's the process that counts. And the second displacement is that if you try to produce something that it is close to science, what you do is you take a material process and you treat it as a process without a subject. You also treat it as a process of main determinations, etc., etc. But so this is really interesting. It also points to how it is possible to have a rupture with ideology. But this is an open question. If we are all inside of ideology, in what way there are ruptures? Huh? Is it because you can have such a total or even totalitarian conception of ideology, where it is only illumination, a Pentecost moment. Huh? You need a kind of divine revelation or Deus ex machina. And it's interesting that these metaphors, religious metaphors, are also epistemological metaphors. So the other question is exactly this conception of that ideology. Yes, people are inside ideology, but they are also inside material practices. Practices of production, practices of theory, practices of politics, practices of sexual difference. All these create, one might say, and I use an epistemological term, the epistemological obstacles that create the possibility of ruptures of the ideological. As a result, science does this kind of rupture with the obvious, the ideological. For example, and for Althusser, who is a very traditional Marxist, Marxism did that for the working class movement, the working class. But it's not that someone found knowledge and gave it to the people. It's part of this material process which is open to ruptures. Never complete. This is why a kind of interventionist materialist philosophy is necessary in terms of Althusser. But I think this is important, and it's also important. Okay. I say a phrase. I stop. You translate, and I say the final part. Okay. So, and this is also very interesting because this is, I insist, a very bodily experience, and one might see that even the body is also a product of ideology. Our bodies are subjectified because we are inside ideology. At the same time, bodies are in constant interaction with the violence of capitalist production, with the violence of police repression, with the violence, sometimes good violence, but the violence, not violence, this is not a good word, but the pressure we receive from our desires. All these are very bodily experience, and all these are part of the possible rupture with ideology.
El profesor Sotiris llama la atención sobre las aportaciones de un discípulo de Althusser, Michel Peugeot, uno de los pioneros del análisis del discurso, que se suicida en 1983, que insiste mucho primero en algo a lo que ya nos hemos referido, que es que el conocimiento científico es un conocimiento sin sujeto. Y aquí hay que aclarar algo: hay seres humanos, hay personas, no es que sea un proceso mecánico. Sin sujeto, en el sentido en que nosotros pensamos en un sujeto soberano que conoce la realidad y es capaz de manipularla a su antojo. Seres humanos existen en un entorno técnico, ideológico, productivo, evidentemente. Hay personas, ustedes y yo, las personas que están implicadas en cada práctica específica. Pero ese no es un sujeto. Es un proceso colectivo, social, de influencia mutua. Esto es muy importante para comprender que no tiene la forma de un sujeto. No podemos llamar que un conjunto de personas que interactúan con prácticas de conocimiento, con instrumental técnico, con actividades políticas, tienen la forma de un sujeto, aunque son seres humanos. Y eso nos da una apertura al problema de la resistencia. En ese proceso material, en el que vivimos en unas relaciones ideológicas, relaciones imaginarias con nuestras condiciones de existencia, la ideología no funciona de manera totalitaria. No prefigura completamente nuestras acciones o nuestra manera de ver la realidad, sino que se abren espacios de desidentificación con los roles que se nos han asignado. Peugeot, en el texto que cita Panagiotis Sotiris, da algunos ejemplos. Eso que tú llamas crisis. Cuando tú dices eso que tú llamas crisis, y que yo puedo llamar acumulación económica salvaje, eso que dice tu religión, son procesos en los cuales los sujetos se desidentifican con la posición en la que están y abren el camino a prácticas de transformación. Eso que tú llamas una mujer, eso que tú llamas un alumno, son esos procesos los que, señala Sotiris, producen rupturas, nunca definitivas y nunca totales, pero capaces de abrir el espacio a la actividad política.
Okay, and finally, so this is very important, and actually, Peugeot suggests two steps. One is counter identification. Sort of try to identify yourself with opposing ideological elements, and then comes this identification, which I think it's a very useful way, because it points that it's not only this possibility of a rupture of ideology. It's not only about a rupture with theoretical ideologies. It's not only about the production of knowledge. It's also about politics. Okay, and it points to how this exit from, let's say, ideology, or at least rupture inside of ideology, which, as we know, is the famous problem of all political philosophy of modernity, the famous problem of voluntary servitude. The fact, and we know that for the most part of history, in particular in the history in the bourgeois era, it's not pure violence that does the work of social reproduction. It's not the fear that you will be arrested. It's how you internalize norms, you take things for granted, or you think that, or simply think that things cannot change. All these are ideology. So, so it points, I think, both Pesce and Althusser to how the very immersion of persons, of bodies, into collective practices, practices of science, practices of politics, practices of exploitation, practices of everyday interaction, practices of desire. All this create the potential for thinking beyond the ideological, for ruptures inside, for dynamics of counter-identification and disidentification with dominant ideology. Now, there are 2 points that, and Althusser also, Althusser on that, initially it seemed that unless workers became, got full knowledge, somehow there was no, then he accepted the possibility of under the influence of Marxism and collective struggle, of transformed forms of ideology. That you can have forms of ideology that are closer to, let's say, to counter-identification. This is very interesting. But I think we can move also beyond that. And I think there are 2 points. One, you cannot have this kind of disidentification outside of collective practices and struggles and constant material interactions. This is the starting point, which means also, if we think it in a more political term, that this idea of this gives another sense to the idea of that the emancipation of the working class is the work of the class itself, which means it's not that you take the workers, you make them join an organization, and in the organization they take courses in Marxism and then they become militant. It does not work this way. It has to do with things that happen in their lives, in their everyday lives, and this is, in a certain way, the starting point. Of course, on the other hand, because Althusser has another notion, the notion of the ideological apparatus of the state. Okay, we discussed how ideology emerges from practices, but exactly because ideology is itself a terrain of struggle, social reproduction is the outcome of the existence of ideological apparatuses. Althusser calls them of the state, not in the sense that they are part of the official state. For example, newspapers are privately owned, and we have religious or private schools or private universities, but they all, but because they play the role of the state, they are part of the broader network of the state, or of what Gramsci might call integral state, stato integrale in Italian. So this is important. So ideology, it's spontaneous, but there are also material apparatuses that, through practices, through rituals, do the job. Which means that, which also means that if you want to have processes of counter-identification and disidentification, you need also not only engagement with struggle, but you also need other forms of political intervention, which brings us to the need for, let's say, counter-apparatuses and counter practices. I won't go to that direction, but it would be very, very interesting. We can discuss it perhaps afterward, what this means in this question of how to manage the dialectic between struggle and organization in the process of counter-identification. But I will just point that Althusser, this also gives Althusser some space to philosophy. Because philosophy for Althusser is exactly that kind of practice that attempts to intervene and push things, push notions, push the relation of forces to the direction of materialism and also emancipation. And to finish, I think I have exceeded my time, I would just like to read something from Althusser, because it has a symbolism. This is from a lecture that Althusser gave at the University of Granada in 1976. As Professor Pestaña explained me, not in this faculty, in the
Hospital Real.
In the Hospital Real. And it was called The Transformation of Philosophy, and it is translated into Spanish, so please read it. So the final paragraph talks about a new practice of philosophy, and it is, and I will read and finish with Althusser. And as with the perspectives on the state, the task assigned Marxist philosophy is not one for the distant future. It is an undertaking for the present, for which Marxists ought to be prepared. Marx was the first to show us the way by putting philosophy into practice into a new and disconcerting form, refusing to produce a philosophy as philosophy, but practicing it in his political, critical, and scientific work, in short, inaugurating a new critical and revolutionary relations between philosophy and the social practices, which are at the same time the stakes and the privileged side of class struggle. This new practice of philosophy serves the proletarian class struggle without imposing upon it an oppressive ideological unity. We know where that oppression has its roots, but rather creating for it the ideological condition for the liberation and free development of social practice. And I still think that this is what we need today. Thank you.
Bien, muchísimas gracias, Panagiotis, por esta conferencia tan bien preparada y tan brillante. Voy a hacer un mínimo resumen de la última intervención y abrimos unos minutos de conversación y de discusión, aunque continuaremos nuestras clases y en diversos lugares hablando y charlando sobre lo que hoy no se nos ha presentado. Bien, algo muy importante es cómo se producen las contraidentificaciones en el espacio de la ideología para Althusser. Esto quiere decir, si hemos dicho que no hay una fuera de la ideología, tenemos que pensar qué tipo de prácticas colectivas son las que nos permitirían pensar de otro modo. Althusser conoció muy bien el tipo de prácticas colectivas que caracterizaron al movimiento obrero. Cogía a los obreros, les daba cursos de formación y los ponía a luchar en una determinada dirección. Eso no funciona. Eso no es suficiente, porque las prácticas colectivas son un conjunto de relaciones que se establecen, no planificables, que generan un tipo de subjetividades específicas. Y aquí el profesor Sotiris señala algo muy importante que normalmente no se comprende de Althusser. La idea de las prácticas ideológicas forman parte del aparato ideológico del Estado. Y entonces normalmente preguntamos del Estado, y yo qué sé, un periódico que es privado y un colegio religioso que es privado, eso no es el Estado. Estado se puede pensar en dos sentidos, como la idea de Estado integral de Antonio Gramsci, que contiene el conjunto de prácticas privadas, pero cuya garantía profunda se encuentra en el Estado, aunque no son estrictamente prácticas públicas. lo cual nos llevaría a otra concepción de lo privado y lo público. Pero hay una forma más sutil que señala muy bien el profesor Sotiris, que es lo que hace el Estado es darle una forma específica a las prácticas, lo cual hace referencia a una forma específica de concebir la filosofía. Esa forma específica de concebir la filosofía es un sistema que ordena la ciencia y las prácticas sociales y que le asigna a cada uno de ellos su lugar. Frente a esa idea de filosofía basada en un Estado que da forma a las prácticas, el profesor Sotiris recuerda, digamos, la conferencia que Althusser impartió en Granada en 1976 en el Hospital Real y que lleva por título precisamente La transformación de la filosofía. En el fragmento que ha leído hay varias cuestiones importantes. En primer lugar, en Marx encontramos una práctica no filosófica de la filosofía. Marx escribe en un género distinto, aunque sus tesis tienen efecto de mover las relaciones que se establecen en las prácticas ideológicas. En segundo lugar, ese tipo de nueva práctica de la filosofía no consigue en establecer un parámetro opresivo al que los demás se tienen que habituar, sino precisamente en romper lo que resulta insoportable en prácticas sociales que desarrollan los seres humanos libremente. Ese modelo de nueva práctica de la filosofía lo que nos ayuda a comprender a la práctica filosófica como algo que mueve la ideología construida bajo la forma del Estado que asigna a cada uno su lugar. Y abrimos, si os parece, la conversación. Hay que ir yéndose sobre las 12:20 porque tenéis clase, muchas personas que estáis aquí, tenemos 15-20 minutos. Mario.
First of all, thank you for your intervention. It has been really interesting. I was thinking about the thesis of the epistemic privilege of the oppressed. It has been developed by contemporary analytic philosophers such as Sellars, McDowell, Alice Grady. The idea that has the same Hegelian roots that this Althusserian critique of empiricism. The idea is, according to McDowell, that initiation into communitarian practices equips us with conceptual capacities that makes us able to access to rational demands from the world.
Mm-hmm.
So my doubt here is whether theoretical practice, as it is characterized by Althusser, can account for this kind of knowledge, that is concrete knowledge, and that it gives us a picture about a non-intellectualist way of knowing what is indeed the case, in a concrete way that doesn't need theoretical intervention. I don't know if I...
No, you're very clear. No, this is... there is apart from this, the epistemological privilege of the oppressed, there are many contemporary readings and writings on, let's say, subaltern epistemologies, the colonial epistemologies, and all these are surely important. I think all these point to, and Althusser was never had a kind of a, let's say, a position similar to one of Lukács. Let's say that there is a kind of epistemic privilege from the part of the proletariat inside the. But Althusser insisted one might say that Marxism and, let's say, the critique of political economy and any theory of the social is a he uses the word scissionist, schismatic in a certain way, ruptural sciences, which means that we have the paradox that, let's say, partiality inside the struggle is a prerequisite for objectivity, which is, of course, contrary to the idea that impartiality is important. So you have to take sides to be objective. So this is a paradox. So this is indeed something with Althusser. Of course, Althusser is a product of classical Marxism and a very specific conception of science. I believe that we can have a dialogue with these questions, because Althusser, I mean, even in an Althusserian perspective, and Althusser was, one might say, scientist. He had a very specific idea of science, very, very classical. Science for Althusser was critique of political economy, was psychoanalysis, was physics in the revolution, etc. I do believe that we can incorporate this idea of counter-epistemologists and decolonial epistemologists in the sense that they point us exactly to this idea that there are ruptures in the ideological, and that subalternity in this sense as the point can be the point of rupture. It can offer a kind of epistemic privilege. I agree on that. On the other hand, I'm also very traditional Marxist on that. This doesn't, takes off the weight, the burden of trying to produce theory. Okay, it's not. I do believe it points, or to use Michel Pechet's distinction, it points to the potential of counter-identification already existing, and it's very necessary, because this is also a useful reminder that people are never always so much hegemonized by the actual ideological position of the subaltern. It's always much more complex, much more agonistic, much more dialectical than when we think. Even as we tend to be politicized. And that's why it's important to listen to the masses, to use a phrase that Althusser, to listen to them, because they have things to say. So I think in what considers, let's say, counter-identification, the start of the process of rupture, this is important. These are very important hindsights, and you can see that in Althusser. Althusser in the 1970s insists more and more that there is a kind of ingenuity, creativity, collective thinking in the collective practices of mass movements, which needs to be our starting point, and that we need to study them, etc., etc. But this, I still think that it does not should not make us abandon also to continue thinking in terms of producing a science. Of course, knowing that science is something tentative and contradictory and always incomplete. But this was a very good question and important.
I will speak about body, a social production of body. Is in relationship with Mario's question. Because I think it's a very great model of analysis who offer Althusser. We have to analyze one body, raw material. What is raw material about body? One physiology, one desire. We can control our desire. One morphology. Fair question. Physiology, desire, morphology is a production of a material practice, ideological practice, sexuation practice, and so on. Second, a work with means of production, this raw material. You have a work process. You are a worker, you are a lecturer on philosophy, you have effect of your work in your body. Second, you may sport. It's in relationship with your process. You have time, you hadn't time to make sport. You have cosmetic intervention. You have chirurgical intervention to modulate the body, to transform the body. You have means of production to work about your raw material. Specifically, it's not raw. It's ideological performance material. Conclusion: you have a great body? No, you have the bad body. You have a body with a lot of problems. The process of production results in the bad body with health problems, with hungry, with a lot of psychical complications. So it's the question of oppressed. Oppressed is thought reality about the bad body, the bad results of ideological or ideology of perfect body.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree, and I would like to say that there's nothing more ideological than the body, and there's nothing more bodily than ideology. And in the sense that you describe, one, ideology is about what we do with our bodies. Ideology is not about so much about what we say. It is also, of course, about what we say, but it's what is the main practical outcome. You wake up in the morning, and you think you have to go there. There are also material constraints, strictly material. You know that you cannot, finance yourself otherwise, but you think it natural. And if you look at the things we do to our bodies, the way our desires are formed, the way we think the good or bad looking of our bodies, all these are all these are ideology. The way we insist on health on our bodies, it's not only simply than whether we feel good or bad. Of course, there's always a kind of let's say a very. It's also about what we are made to think that it's good with our body. This is part of ideology, and not necessarily as a kind of brainwashing. It can be relational. There can be openings. Okay, for example. For example, sport, athletic sports. Yeah, it is a kind of an ideological projection of a good body, good-looking body, etc., etc. But at the same time, and if you look, especially in working class kids traditionally, they also like to use their body. They also invest on their bodies. They think, why? I can do something with myself. So this is a tension. This is the tension of the ideological. This is where you can intervene. If you go into aesthetics and cosmetic surgery, that's also interesting. How we produce our bodies. Bodies are socially produced. There's nothing more socially produced than the human body, and this is where ideology. But on the other hand, also, it's the other way around. Okay, ideology is something that we experience in our body. We experience through our bodies. And even what we call the raptures of the ideological is exactly, in a certain way, in a very direct way, things that happen to our bodies. Being tired. This is a very bodily feeling. Being bored. This is also very bodily. If you think all the things that can be wrong, this is about, and sometimes this comes in contrast with perception, in contrast with why I've done the right thing, or yeah. So yeah, this is about, it is about our bodies are socialized also by means of ideology. And I think that it's useful to maintain the notion of ideology in social science exactly because it enables us to think at a range where we can see how it affects, because ideology affects politics, affects discourses, affects desire, how is desire socially influenced and construct, optics, everything. Yeah, but I think it's it's something that we should never forget, that this is in the end about human bodies, how, and in the last instance about how subjectification is always also subjection and resistance at the same time, and sometimes the resistance of the body is important. And I'm not saying simply the fact that when we resist with our bodies, and it's interesting that we still do. We go and occupy space. We go and move into space. We go and confront policemen into space. Okay, and we still, even though we are all fully immersed into a virtual reality, we still think that okay, when we do the real thing, it has to include your body, and it's a good thing. So yeah, resistance, but it's also the kind of resistance that you feel in your body. And I think this is something that and it's this of course opens up a huge different area of studies, and we have studies on that, how this is being managed. Because if you look at, health politics, they are also socially determined, health management, how our bodies are being managed, how it's also part of us being persuaded, for example, that it's not something in our bodies, or it's something simply in our bodies but not in our society, whereas our bodies simply warn us about society. If you look at, what's more telling of how social relationship and class struggle is inscribed in our bodies than the very fact of the social production of vulnerability, the social production of disease. And it is, which, to give an example, we still, statistics still tell us that social inequality per se, not social unequal access to health services, social inequality per se creates a kind of socioeconomic stress that is very evident still in health statistics. Societies that are more unequal or have greater socioeconomic stress will have greater rate of both cardiovascular diseases, greater rate of cancers, and greater rate of deaths from despair, suicide, abstinence use. Yeah, that's how inequality can be inscribed in our bodies.
Bueno, pues son las 12:20, es el momento de que vayamos cerrando la conferencia. Panagiotis Sotiris estará esta tarde en el máster de Filosofía Contemporánea, específicamente en el seminario de Filosofía Política a las 3:30. Es en el aula 1-2 de la Facultad de Psicología. Estáis invitados e invitadas a venir si así lo deseáis. Y bueno, pues evidentemente estamos haciendo trabajar un montón al cuerpo del profesor Sotiris, al que le agradezco de nuevo la calidad y la preparación de la conferencia. Es un ejemplo sobre cómo se habla en un entorno universitario y los muchos temas de discusión que nos abren para continuar hablando, sin él físicamente, pero sí virtualmente. Muchísimas gracias, Panagiotis.